Welcome back. You're still tuned into News and Views on myself, Salailo Makwidere, and we're still doing our rolling coverage of the Israeli-US war on Iran. And in focus right now is obviously the biggest story in the world, that ceasefire. And it looks like less than 48 hours after that to call it high stakes ceasefire between the US and Iran was announced, it looks like the agreement is already under serious strain. Israel is accusing Washington of violating key terms of the deal, pointing to continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon, alleged drone incursions, and disagreements over nuclear rights. And at the heart of this dispute is a fundamental question that all of us need to be asking ourselves. Was this a narrow ceasefire between Iran and the US, or a broader agreement meant to halt conflict across the region? Because in the last few hours, even early this morning, we saw Israel bombarding Lebanon, and not just the southern region as it has been the norm, but Beirut. They're hitting where the mass population, where a lot of people in Lebanon are concentrated in, and it's going to be rather interesting to see how it pans out and how those negotiations could potentially involve the rest of the region, because on the ground it looks and feels like the war has not paused at all. It has shifted. And now we're joined by Press TV correspondent in South Africa, Hassen Seria, who'll be giving us a bit more insight on this and what he's gathering out of Tehran at this current moment. But Hassan, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure. Really appreciate you giving us your time. Welcome to News and Views.
Thank you very much, Salala.
I think if you can give us just a short synopsis of the last 24 hours, you can even stretch it to the last 48 hours since that ceasefire agreement was reached between the US and Iran. What are you gathering?
I think the important thing, Salilo, is to consider when that announcement was made. It was as everyone, I think, around the world was anticipating that 8 p.m. deadline that had been set by Donald Trump for what he said was he was going to obliterate an entire civilization. Now, considering, I mean, we're not going to go into the genocidal nature of that claim, but just the extent of this was going to be the peak of the war as such for the Americans. And yet, just before that deadline approaches, you find that this announcement is made that a ceasefire has suddenly been announced. The important thing as well is that it is a 10-point plan that is presented by Iran. It is not the 15-point plan that the Americans have put forward, or something that has been worked out between taking of the 15 points and the 10 points and sort of coming to some sort of agreement. So what we can understand from this is that this was a major step down for the US. This was the US approaching that deadline, and it then had to take a very serious decision in terms of, did it have the capacity to really go ahead with what Trump was claiming? We know also from the experience of the personality of Donald Trump is that he is somebody that makes all of these major claims. We saw it with the claims of reopening the Strait of Hormuz, the multiple deadlines, and keep on moving of those deadlines. And we've seen that over the past 2 to 3 year period also play out with Donald Trump. So this was one of those moments, and we saw that step down. So from the outset, this ceasefire, I'd say, wasn't a ceasefire in the true sense of the word. It wasn't the type that, you know, there's a clear understanding from the parties. What are the terms of the ceasefire? Has there been some sort of a sit down, some sort of a negotiation? We know that Pakistan was the key mediator in terms of this, but it appears that this was something that was forced at that moment. Normally with ceasefires, they don't normally take effect immediately as well. There would be an indication that the ceasefire kicks in at this time tomorrow, because naturally the information needs to be communicated down the various channels. It needs to get to the guys on the ground. Do not strike, you know, all of those elements. As we've been seeing now with the United States and with Israel, is that there had to be communication on that side as well between the two parties in terms of coming to an understanding of what the terms of that ceasefire would be. So I think from the outset, this was a decision that was reached in that context of this major anticipated attack from the United States based on the claims of Trump. Personally, I don't feel that there ever was that sense of a threat that would have come to bear. And I'll tell you why. Because if we look at the instances and the incidents over the past weekend, that is from the downing of that F-15 jet by the Iranians, and then what the Americans claimed was a rescue operation. If we look at the scale of that operation, this wasn't a search and rescue operation. This was, according to my reading, an attempt to trial the land invasion that the Americans had been threatening. Of course,
Mm.
that backfired quite majorly for the Americans, and they realized at that point that the ground invasion didn't look like a viable option at this point in time. The question then is, what is the next step? Now, if we look at the realities on the ground at that particular point in time, Iran had all of the cards in its hands. It had control of the Strait of Hormuz. It had the negotiating channels that were open with, for example, through Pakistan. And also, we saw, not necessarily overtly, but from Russia and China, also an involvement in the situation from a diplomatic point of view. And just prior to that announcement, we had an attempt at the United Nations Security Council. This, I'd say, was almost a last-ditch effort by the US to try to get the Strait of Hormuz opened up as well, and to go back to what was the status quo before the this illegal attack on Iran. What happened there was we had not one but two of the permanent members, Russia and China, very clearly using their veto power here against that attempt. Now, this is quite critical because if you look at it from a very basic level, it is in the interest of Russia and China to have the Strait of Hormuz open. As we know, the US doesn't necessarily rely as much on the
Mhm.
strait for movement of oil. Naturally, there's a knock-on effect in terms of the overall price of oil and the impact that that has on inflation globally and the markets as well. But from a Chinese and Russian point of view, the opening of the Strait of Hormuz was more in their interest as well. But the fact that they took the decision to use their veto here showed us that they were, from a diplomatic point of view, they were making a statement. And this was a very clear statement. We also understand that as far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is not just the mediator here. We've
Mhm.
got to assess Pakistan's strategic relations with various countries within the region. China is a very strong backer of the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis also have relations with the Americans, yes, but in terms of the strategic relations, Pakistan finds itself more closer to China than it does to the United States. So when we look at Pakistan emerging here as the key broker of this ceasefire agreement, we get an understanding that the Chinese here were also very much involved, or the Chinese were key players within the developing situation that we found. And I think that is what sort of brought us to that almost abrupt sort of announcement of this ceasefire. So it was always going to be a very tenuous one. Israel, naturally, being the entity that it is, was always going to try and push. And that is exactly what it tried. As you mentioned, within this past 24 hours, in that massive bombing campaign against Lebanon, this was not directed at Hezbollah. This was not the normal Israeli sort of attacks in terms of trying to target Hezbollah. This went after Lebanon as a country. And the message here that they're trying to send is to the Lebanese government. This is the Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, as well as the President own, because those two entities, in fact, they've been internally in Lebanon been accused of treason, because since the outset of this latest aggression by Israel, they have been siding with the Israeli side, in fact, blaming the national resistance of the country. And in fact, not just since the start of this, but since they came to power, their main aim was to disarm Hezbollah. And that is part of why, with Israel carrying out that bombing campaign, devastating bombing campaign, targeting so many civilians, so many young children being massacred here, that it was a message to the Lebanese government that Internally, they need to take action, and also potentially to push Lebanon towards the situation of a civil war as well.
And I think I want to stay on that point because Lebanon has emerged as I think the biggest fault line. It seems the US says it is excluded from the ceasefire agreement. Iran insists it is included. How did such a critical ambiguity make it into this quote unquote deal from your perspective?
Well, I don't think there's any ambiguity, because if you look at the 10 points, sorry, Lebanon is definitely included there. We must also understand where the Iranians are coming from. The Iranians are saying we want West Asia to be a region where peace prevails. Now, of course, for as long as the Zionist regime exists, we are going to see conflict within the region. But there's another aspect that the Iranians are requesting, and that is the removal of the American presence, because that is exactly what the American presence within West Asia represents as well. It is there for the sake of war. It has bases there, military bases. It is not coming there with companies and so on to do business as such. It is there for the purpose of war. So the Iranians are requesting the American withdrawal from West Asia, and of course their attempts to curtail Israel. But the key important point that the Iranians have been pushing since this war started, and even prior to this, is that they want West Asia to be a region of peace. And so there is no way in which Lebanon could not be part of this. And we even had the Pakistani Prime Minister, who brokered the ceasefire agreement, coming out and saying that Lebanon definitely is part of this ceasefire agreement. So yes, I think this is the Americans and the Israelis, based on the disagreements that are emerging between those two parties. For example, the Israeli Yair Lapid in Israel has said that Israel was not even at the negotiating table, was not even consulted as far as this agreement of a ceasefire was concerned. So the Israelis appear to have been left out of this from the United States, because the United States here, we could almost say, put America first at this point in time because of the realities on the ground. So I think when looking at this, it is the Americans and the Israelis now trying to work out exactly how they can work things out on their side. And therefore, because Israel is the entity it is, it needs to continue going into Lebanon and trying to maintain that sort of conflict. I think the other aspect is that there was an impression that Israel and the Americans had, and this was the impression that was also created more broadly, is that Hezbollah did not pose the threat that it showed that it has the capability for during this 40-day period as well. It was thought to have been a decimated force, a force of weakness that whose military capability, at least even its political sort of strength, had been diminished. And Hezbollah has shown on the battlefield that that is not the case. And therefore, this takes Israel back to 2024, when Hezbollah was considered to be a strong force in waiting, that Israel now has to, again, as it would put it, neutralize that sort of threat on its northern border. So I think this is the politics at play. It is more from within the American and Israeli camps, rather than any question about the clarity of what the Iranians were pushing for in terms of having peace within West Asia.
We saw authorities from Iran coming out and saying if Israel continues to bombard Lebanon as they have been, they could potentially shut down the Strait of Hormuz. From your opinion, how feasible is that? How likely is that reality?
Well, we went into this ceasefire agreement with Iran holding all of the cards in its hands. Um, the Strait of Hormuz, it already had established that control over it. And we've seen already since that bombing yesterday, Iran has done exactly that. It has closed off the Strait of Hormuz again. Naturally, there is an understanding in terms of certain nations getting through a negotiated process, a toll booth, as some have put it, through the strait, so that there is movement for certain nations. But in terms of control, Iran is still fully in control. Nothing has really changed within the past 24 to 48 hours in terms of the strength that Iran has established on the battlefield. And the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, is saying that we still have our hand on the trigger. I think the history of the United States, as far as Iran particularly is concerned here, going back to June of last year, going back to February of this year, is that the Iranians have learned that the Americans are not a trustworthy party or counterpart. We also know that Donald Trump, even his performance during this war, contradicting himself in the same statement, that indicates to you clearly that this individual is not a credible individual. He is capable of lying. He is capable of misleading. And so even with this current ceasefire and these talks that are scheduled to begin tomorrow in Pakistan, the Iranians are going with that not in the back of their mind, but at the forefront of their understanding that there's a potential that the Americans will violate the ceasefire, they will resume the war, that they could try some other tactic as well, even though they have said here that they are coming to the negotiating table. I think from the Iranian perspective, one of the reasons, because the Iranians, even less than 24 hours before that announcement of the agreement of the ceasefire, the Iranians were still saying, we are not going for a ceasefire. But the reason why the Iranians did accept this at this point in time is because the 10-point plan, if you read it carefully, it accepts all of the Iranian demands. And these are key demands: the lifting of all of the sanctions, both the primary and secondary, the continued Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, and that will be in conjunction with Oman as well, which is its shared waters. And there's an understanding from the Omani side as well, the removal of the American forces from the region, the establishment of peace as far as Lebanon is concerned, the other resistance movements, and so on. So, from the Iranian perspective, because it was essentially an acceptance of all of the points that they had put down. It did make sense at this point in time. So I think they're giving opportunity to these talks. Hopefully something can emerge from it. But as the IRGC has said, they've got the trigger on the gun, and the Iranians at least, going to those talks are fully aware that that there's potential of a resumption of these hostilities. What is important from the American side is that the Americans seem to have made a major change. We know that previous talks were conducted by Steve Witkoff. We had people like Jared Kushner that was present. If we look at these individuals and the reality, this is the infiltration of the Israeli regime and Israeli system into the American system. Jared Kushner, since the first term of Donald Trump, every decision that has been taken as far as giving Israel free reign, as far as violating the sanctity of Jerusalem, of Al Aqsa, all of those decisions came from Jared Kushner. Everything was done in the interest of Israel and not by putting America first, as the American mantra would be, or Trump's mantra would be. And that is similar with Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff is an Israeli citizen. Steve Witkoff has served within the Israeli occupation forces. So even with the talks with Lebanon and so on, you had essentially an Israeli representative under the guise of being there for the United States that was pushing this. What we have now is J.D. Vance that is being presented as the individual that will be leading these talks on behalf of the United States. So we see already this change. And J.D. Vance appears to be still within the right-wing camp, still within the Republicans, but somebody that has a view that this is Israel's war, that this is not the American war. Of course, we'll continue to hear the rhetoric and so on from him, but this is also part of the major shift, I think, that has taken place in terms of the American administration and how we're going into these talks. But still, this is a tenuous ceasefire, and I think one where the Iranians are still very, very wary.
No, most definitely. I think we're going to leave it on that note, Brother Hassen. I'm sure there's going to be many more developments that we're going to be talking about. We have unfortunately run out of time, but really appreciate it. I think that was point. And I think everyone's up to speed now with what's currently happening. Really appreciate it.
Shukran very much. Thank you.
There we go. And with that, we're going to take a quick break. News and Views continues after this.